Greetings adventurers, and welcome to the Loot Goblin Marketplace. But before I go any further, I wanted to give D&D Dice a shout out, my favorite dice shop and where half of my paycheck goes to every month. They've got a lot of options, including their original 11-piece dice sets that they call the King of Crits series. Be sure to use the code LootGoblin to support the channel at dnddice.com, or you can just click the link down in that video description and it'll be added when you check out with your favorite dice. As an edgelord myself, my favorite collections are the Plague Doctor and Blood Hunter 11-piece sets, which I use alongside their Tomb of the Lich dice tower. Anyways, back to the video. What do you do when you have a player that constantly tries to speedrun missions to the point they start referring to every NPC as either a quest giver or a waste of time? And worse yet, what do you do when they take up the mantle of Dungeon Master and keep that hyper-optimizing mindset to get the best of the party? I think the answer for me is that I would walk away immediately. I'm here for a fun group dynamic and the chance to actually do something cool every once in a while. The TLDR is the Dungeon Master and player tries flexing on the group during games, relentlessly bullying a player until he's nervous and paranoid, and bogging down an entire campaign in pedantic technicalities and endless encounters. Today's treasure goes by the name Dungeon Master / player, bullies party members, cheats, and metagames to look good around the table. So this is the story of the first Dungeon Master many of my group ever had, and how, both as a Dungeon Master and as a player, he tried using the hobby of tabletop role-playing games to try and assert his dominance over his social group, leading to endless Dungeon Master versus player encounters that bogged down his entire campaign, out and out bullying of younger players, screwing over other players' plans, and finally straight up murdering a player's character simply to demonstrate that he could. This is likely going to turn into a long post, as we played a lot of games with this guy over the course of a few years, and while there are too many instances of his behavior to mention, or even fully remember all of, I've tried to boil it down to 3 campaigns and the problem behavior in each. As I've seen other players do this, let me set the scene by laying out the important players involved in the core story. We had a large group, but only a handful are relevant in this post. The names are of course changed from their originals. Kolya is the problem player in question. Then there's me, who's me, sometimes a player, sometimes a dungeon master, but mostly a player. Then there was Freddy, the bullied player, who looked up to Kolya a lot. Then Virginia, another player who became relevant in the second part of this post. Then there was Will, a player who joined our group late in the story, but became key in the third and final part of the post. And finally Sebastian, the Dungeon Master for the campaign played in the third part of this post. Okay, without further ado, Campaign 1. Encounters. Encounters never change. Kolya was the first Dungeon Master most of us had played with. I had played some one-on-one online games before this, so this was my first tabletop role-playing game both in person around a table and with a group. Virginia and Freddy were both getting the first taste of role-playing games too, with Virginia and I joining a campaign in progress of Curse of Strahd. Oh god, it's always Curse of Strahd. This campaign, as much as I remember it, went fine. I am sure there were red flags in retrospect, but none which necessarily stood out to me at the time. There was some rigmarole where Kolya, our Dungeon Master, focused a massive homebrewed side story on Freddy's character, making the naturally skittish and paranoid Freddy quite anxious about every action his character took, but this just seemed like part of the game and the overall horror vibe of the setting. Overall, we had fun, and our experiences as a group began to bring us all closer together, so that we became friends outside of D&D. Overall, it was a successful first game, even if Strahd ultimately crushed us in a humiliating total party kill. Maybe that was the first of the red flags. Yeah, you think? We had begun playing during a second night of the week, on top of our weekly sessions, both to try different campaigns and or systems, and allow other players to get a shot at DMing. As a player, Kolya favored finely tuned, optimized builds that allowed him to dominate in sessions, doing everyone's jobs better than their specialized classes could do themselves. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing beyond a few bruised egos. Power gamers are going to power game. There's generally nothing wrong with that. We certainly had no issue with him having an optimized character sheet. What was significantly more frustrating was Kolya's habit of metagaming. He would power through any and all attempts by the party to roleplay or explore organically, saying out loud, "I smell a quest giver," and barreling through scenes and locations just to get to what he thought was the next plot hook to set up the next quest quest and move on through the game. He wanted to win D&D, and would passively aggressively mock other players for role-playing and not immediately knowing where to go to advance the plot, using his in-character voice to chide our characters for being stupid idiots while also in character using meta terminology like plot hook or quest giver. At one point we skipped an entire settlement because he straight up asked the dungeon master where the plot hook was, so he could beeline straight to it, get the salient point of the quest we had to do, and zip off again with us having no other choice but to follow along in his wake. It was frustrating, especially as while we had no problems with his well-optimized builds, we were by and large a party of role players, and liked getting sidetracked with NPCs and other silly nonsense that you get up to while messing around in D&D. But this approach to D&D became amplified when he found himself back in the DM's chair after a hiatus, running a second iteration of Curse of Strahd. We had signed up to this eagerly, looking forward to a chance to avenge our first party's defeat, and to his credit, Kolya weaved in some background lore that made it clear that the first party was canon in the history of the game setting, and that we were very much going in to finish what they started. But either tempered by his previous experience metagaming as a player, or emboldened by our group's closer friendship bonds by this point, we had been playing together now for well over a year. This was where his DMing style went off the rails. His I must win at D&D attitude he had demonstrated as a player is now how he approached the business of DMing, except instead of trying to win the campaign, he was trying to win against the party, more or less. There's a very important, very annoying caveat to that mindset that I'll get to below. At this point, through his behavior around the table as a player, he had already sunk his hooks into Freddy and had Freddy worn down and tormented by his teasing, mainly in-game. It got to the point where his constant degrading of Freddy's in-character decisions and actions had convinced Freddy that he was, in Freddy's own words, too stupid for D&D. Freddy was in fact a player whose encyclopedic knowledge of the game was matched by his great and often hilarious role-playing instincts, and he was a very creative and skilled dungeon master to boot. But that low self-confidence had allowed Kolya to build himself up in Freddy's mind as the paragon of all things D&D, such that whenever Kolya questioned anything, Freddy was quick to back him up and claim he was right. When Kolya suggested anything, Freddy ate it up unquestionably. Kolya had, as one example, led Freddy to believe that mending was the most important cantrip in the game, after an episode involving a torn and thus illegible letter, prompting Freddy to make sure that every character he ever rolled up for one of Kolya's games had mending. Freddy would go to great lengths to mention that he had taken mending, as if seeking Kolya's approval. As it turned out, by design or luck of the draw, Kolya's second iteration of Curse of Strahd never once involved the necessary use of the spell mending. Freddy's broken self-esteem and submissive behavior towards Kolya was an important facet in how the campaign played out. Freddy's natural nervousness and paranoia, stoked by Kolya's constant bullying, would make him stress out of character over the mundane details in character. We were going into a vaguely Eastern European-esque country in another plane of existence. Would it be cold? Would we need heavy coats? Cue Kolya insisting the entire party spend 10 gold pieces apiece to purchase heavy coats, or suffer penalties for the cold weather. We in fact later suffered penalties for being too hot because we actually wore the coats. This pedantic approach to little details swamped down every action the party tried to take. Try to open a locked door? Not only do you fail, you have to roll an exceedingly high dex save to avoid falling down. Fail that save, well, you take 1d6 damage, and also you just bumped into the person behind you, who now has to roll the same high dex save, and oh, they fell down? Well, the next person now has to roll, and so on and so on, thus that the entire party became too afraid to touch or do anything, lest we fall victim to this kind of HP and time draining nonsense. At least 2 players lost their characters in the first sessions through this kind of pedantic nonsense. One dwarf who went prone thanks to triggering a trap kept rolling low, which the dungeon master insisted meant he kept standing up and falling over again, taking more damage on the fall. This continued until the dwarf literally died. I would be fuming at this point. And this attitude carried into encounters too. And oh, there were a lot of encounters. After the first session of this new campaign, we had somehow, I'm positive we were only level 1 at the time, managed to kill a werewolf. There were admittingly a lot of us in the group, as I've said before. After the session, the dungeon master called us all stupid to our faces for not dead checking the dead werewolf, claiming that it was just gonna roll death saves and get back up and fight us again next time. We called bullshit on this, saying that it's not as if every monster in the game is expected to get death saves when they drop to 0 HP. While we were willing to accept that, sure, while the Dungeon Master can rule that particular monsters do in fact get death saves, we certainly weren't stupid for not thinking of it, since every monster we had fought in D&D at that point just died as soon as they hit 0 HP. There is a reason "how do you want to do this" was our group's wink wink, nudge nudge traditional way of ending a fight. But as mentioned, Freddy by this point was so subservient to Kolia's will and way of thinking that he took Kolia's side, and lamented out loud that we, him included, were doomed to fail this campaign because we were too stupid to see what was coming. And while the dead checking didn't go beyond that single event, I suspect Kolia pulled that decision to give the werewolf death saves out of his ass just to mock us for something that wasn't even strictly in the rules. His encounters continued to bog down the game. There was no rhyme or reason to what we would be fighting or where. To an extent, it became clear he was just pulling out monsters he was excited to get to run. We fought a Deathclaw the week after Tomb of Foes was released, for instance, but we fought it on a boat for some reason in a raging storm on the high seas, having been transported there by Magical Lake or something. Wait, is this still Curse of Strahd? I'm confused. Where every attempt to finesse encounters, scout them out, avoid them, or find a way to gain a strategic or tactical advantage would fall flat. Kolia, after all, was the Dungeon Master, and the world was his to command. Thus, every plan the players ever came up with would coincidentally run into some entirely unforeseen complication or blocker that we were stupid for not seeing all along. Cue Freddy's almost wailing lamentations that we were just not able to handle this campaign and we were all doomed. And Kolia's super hot and handsome, guys. He's the best, isn't he? Man, I want to be just like him. At the time, I grew increasingly frustrated with his chiding of the players for not being able to foresee random decisions that he as a Dungeon Master made just to frustrate our efforts. Upon reflection, I suspect he was well aware of how arbitrary his own powers were and was intentionally doing it as some kind of weird, sad power trip. Oh yeah, almost definitely. The encounters, meanwhile, would roll on endlessly. We'd finish one arbitrary random encounter and stumble into the next, ad nauseum, until at one point I mentioned to Virginia that we had been fighting in random encounters with no forward plot progression for somewhere in the ballpark of 12 plus hours, spread across multiple sessions. And it wasn't as if these encounters added to the sense of survival horror that was supposed to permeate the Curse of Strahd campaign. Oh no, nothing so well thought out or carefully paced. We never lost resources as a result of the encounters that raised the stakes of the campaign in any significant way. We would always be restored to full resources after these random encounters, be it through a long rest or some NPC having some spell to bring us all back to full fighting strength just in time for our next session-long battle. In the instances, and there were many, where the encounters overpowered us or threatened a total party kill, random NPCs from elsewhere in the setting would show up to Deus Ex Machina us to safety and heal us up so that the next encounter could begin. Yippee! That's when I think Virginia and myself finally spoke up against these encounters, when it became apparent that this wasn't even about the Dungeon Master beating the players. He wasn't killing us, he was just dragging us kicking and screaming through the boring, pointless encounters, either because he wanted to prove he could, or simply because he was bored of the campaign itself. One final detail of his DMing of Curse of Strahd that deserves a special mention is the sheer volume of nat 20s he rolled in combat against players. They were endless, and not blind either. He often made a point to roll them in front of the DM screen so that we could all see it happening. Cue, you guessed it, more distressed wailing from Freddy. At this point, we just accepted that he was getting lucky. There was a running joke in the group that Kolia could control dice, but upon reflection, Virginia had suggested to me that either his dice were loaded, or we had somehow engineered a way to fake roll, making sure that it came up on the number he wanted. He had an unusual way of rolling, which involved him placing the dice in the palm of his hand, and then tilting his hand to let it fall straight onto the table. No roll, just a fall. Looking back, I can't believe we didn't say anything about it at the time. As a Dungeon Master now, I never allow players to get away with not properly properly rolling dice. Though we eventually forced this campaign to end, he started to Dungeon Master what was supposed to be a one-shot almost a year later, where all the same behavior, the ridiculousness, the character killing slapstick saves, the endless encounters, the punishing player ingenuity by arbitrarily ruling on what was never going to work, etc., came to be exhibited again. We came to a decision to quietly dissuade him from ever DMing for our group again, but then COVID hit and forced us apart anyways, and his growing out-of-game toxicity eventually forced us to cut ties with him for good. So that sets the stage, I think, for the behavior that was to follow in the 2 other campaigns, DM'd by others in our group, myself included. I am always dumbfounded with the amount of punishment that players are willing to put up with. I'm genuinely exhausted just reading about these encounters. I can't imagine slogs like these for 3 hours at a time, every week, for the course of a year. And to make matters even worse, now they say this is part 1 of 3. I get that the first part is the longest of the 3 campaigns as written in this story, but haven't you guys been through enough? I guess every terrible dungeon master / player always has one person that's kind of egging them on or enabling them. In this story, it's Freddy here, and it seems like Freddy's really good at DMing himself, being a player, and role-playing, but for some reason, he's willing to put all his agency aside and just gas up Kolya over and over again. I get sometimes as a new player, you're not really confident in your craft, and you're playing with a guy who's played for like 10 years, and you're like, wow, this guy can do no wrong. But trust me when I say, just because you've been playing for a while doesn't mean you're an expert, and it doesn't mean that you excel in all areas of the game. Honestly, I wouldn't even argue that someone who hyper-optimized their character is necessarily even good at the game. Truthfully, he might just have a good internet connection, and he just looked up a build that's strong, and instead of trying to find something that works for the campaign and is a playstyle he enjoys, he's just playing whatever's the strongest available builds on like Reddit or whatever website he might happen to be looking on. If your only goal at the table is to roll big numbers to the point where you're letting the internet decide your build and you're rolling the dice in a way to cheat it always into a nat 20, I don't really find that impressive. Honestly, I don't know how much worse it can get at this point, but let's see what happens in campaign 2. It seems like in this case the author is the dungeon master. So let's jump into campaign 2, Little Man with a Nowhere Plan. Eventually I built up enough rapport with the group and was confident enough to attempt to run a Vampire the Masquerade game. This turned into a slow burning disaster because of how broken the system is and how inexperienced I was DMing for such a large group of players. When I later ran a Vampire 5th edition game for the same group, plus or minus a few faces, it went a lot smoother and had a much more satisfactory ending. Kolya, for the most part, was manageable as a player. He was gracious when a ruling didn't go his way, and he would state his objections to it out of character in person, but accept it in good humor at the table. A perfectly valid and much appreciated approach to respecting the dungeon master and not causing trouble. He would even accept rulings in a way when I was clearly wrong and he was right, and as a result, on more than one occasion, I realized my mistake, admitted it, and allowed him the benefits of whatever rule or event he was objecting to my decision on. He demonstrated an attitude that anyone could stand to learn from as a player. Vampire the Masquerade 20th Anniversary Edition was a horrendously broken system with a famously badly written rulebook, so these sort of disagreements about the rules cropped up a lot. The problem was not so much on the meta level, but I guess the macro level. Through his antics as a player and as a dungeon master in Curse of Strahd, Kolya had affected this god complex whereby he presented himself as the master of every game system we played, someone who was always working the angles and always had a grand plan that would reveal itself at the opportune moment. Unfortunately, Freddy, as mentioned above, bought into this act completely and fundamentally, so much so that Kolya's persona effectively took on a life of its own as a running joke within the group, similar to his mastery of rolling dice. This was apparently true for Kolya too, who seemed to buy into his own hype and went into my vampire campaign preparing to tear down the setting I'd crafted based on our home city and dominate the world of Vampire the Masquerade. This manifested at first as it usually did. Kolya attached himself to Freddy's character and established himself in a dominant position over him, tormenting him both in and out of game, and whittling down Freddy's already bedrock low confidence. This got so bad in fact that after a series of failed rolls during a bar fight between Freddy's character and an NPC, Freddy broke down a little, fretting about how terribly made his character was and how he just wasn't smart enough to play this game. He actually went quiet at the table and refused to contribute for the rest of the session. It was clear he was on the verge of tears. Myself and Virginia went out of the way to assure him that that was not the case, that the dice sometimes just do not fall the way you want them to, and I made sure the consequences of his lost bar fight were severely mitigated. Nobody had an issue with this. Freddy was clearly upset, and I didn't want to have him throw away a character he loved. He had worked so hard on his backstory and had been super excited to talk through various character details with me. Freddy's character ended up in the hospital, and Kolya went to see him. Before anything could happen, 3 vampires from a rival faction who both Kolya and Freddy had pissed off showed up to attack them, causing both of them to run away. Kolya, however, always made sure to let Freddy know that he had gone there with the intent of killing his character. Dude, why? I cannot be sure if this was true or just some more mind games that dominate and bully Freddy. I am sure, however, that had he attempted to go through with it, I would have strictly disallowed it. It's Vampire the Masquerade, some inter-player conflict and intrigue is to be expected, but at my table I have a strict consent rule. You can do anything you want to another player's character, provided that player has consented beforehand. If not, you can't so much as touch a hair on their head. This issue of player consent and player-on-player aggression, in fact, would be a major issue in the climax of Kolya's story in part 3 below. This was the kicker that defined Kolya's entire experience of my campaign. Kolya was only some kind of tabletop Jesus in Freddy's mind. As a player, while great at optimizing his builds and working out the mechanical end of things, he was fairly average. And there's nothing wrong with that. I consider myself to be an average player and honestly a subpar dungeon master. But when you're trying to live up to the persona you yourself have crafted of being a 4-dimensional chess player, Bill Belichickian super player, that's when you start to struggle if the steak doesn't live up to the sizzle. And Kolya struggled. In order to prove that he was bigger than the game world his character existed in, he had no regard for the structures of authority I'd put in place around his character and the setting. He attacked his superiors, he attacked powerful vampires from other factions, he betrayed the trust of quest givers and party members alike. Now, as I said, this is Vampire the Masquerade. Anyone even remotely familiar with the game setting knows how autocratic its power structures are, how tyrannical its characters, and how constrained low-level players are in how they get to operate in and shape the world around them. Very quickly, Kolya had pissed off just about every major player in my city, and was on the run for his life against every vampire faction worth mentioning. This led to some erratic and strange behavior, as if in a bid to prove to the party that, not to worry, this was all part of his plan. Kidnapping the child of a powerful faction leader, embracing, i.e. making vampires of 3 random club goers, and then leaving them to starve in a house when he realized he didn't actually want to be responsible for 3 terrified and starving newborn vampires. He had no real plan for his characters, beyond trying to make it look as if they were working towards some grand scheme that only he could see, and that Freddy of course was overawed by, despite nothing Kolya did ever coming to fruition. After abandoning the 3 clubbers he had turned into vampires, he discovered that the vampire faction leader marked him for death, so he decided to return to the house he had left the baby vampires in, only to find it surrounded by police investigating a homicide on the site. You know, the child he had kidnapped then murdered. I teed this up with room to spare. He saw the flashing lights and the police tape from down the street. All he had to do was turn and walk away. But of course he decided he could take on the whole cohort of police, so charged the barricade and died. That was character number 1. I would allow him to spontaneously resurrect character 1 when he similarly screwed up character 2, based on a misinterpretation of damage rules on my part when the combat encounter with the police was playing out. And it's during character 2 that bigger problems in this campaign started, because while Kolya had been flailing around ineffectually, trying to convince everyone that he was playing a Byzantine long game grandmaster plan that would shock and wow us all to break my game forever, Virginia's character was actually doing something of the kind. Kolya did not like this, not one little bit. After all his posturing, and after so many humiliations when his nonsensical actions failed to materialize in some kind of success, he was not happy that Virginia had gone and lucked into doing exactly that. He began to take whatever actions he could to hamper Virginia's plans, both through metagaming and through desperate flails that, like his erratic attempts to string together a coherent plot up to that point, made no sense and only backfired massively. His second character basically played himself out of the game by, after completing a quest, taking a van and randomly, without any in-character motivation or explanation, driving into the front lobby of another faction's headquarters in the city. I told him this would basically mean he had become a marked man by his own clan. He had just carried out an unsanctioned act of war against one of the city's most feared factions, a war that his clan had no reason to persecute when they could just hand him over by way of restitution. Kolya accepted this and agreed that his character would essentially go into hiding and out of the game. By this point, he and I discussed my mistake of counting damage for his previous character who had gone down in the hail of police bullets. So I was happy to let his character suddenly reanimate in a city morgue somewhere and get back into the game. He still bore the weight of several angry vampires out for his head, but he was back in the game. His first action upon getting clear of the morgue was to take a stolen cell phone and declare he was going to ring Virginia's character. Immediately, Virginia, already pissed about the unprompted attack on her clan's base, questioned why he would do that. For context, this character had no interaction with Virginia's character. Him, in proving he was above the party in the game, had gone off on his own while Virginia and the others were together being fed plot hooks. His character in-universe had seen Virginia in passing only once, never exchanged a word with her, and then gone off to kidnap that aforementioned powerful vampire's child. The character probably couldn't even remember her, much less claim to have his phone number. Virginia pointed all of this out, and it became clear that Kolya was only trying to involve himself in her story now that she had effectively outplayed him for best Littlefinger impressionist in the group. I disallowed the phone call on the grounds that he literally had no in-character reason to make it, and probably didn't have her number anyway. The campaign didn't last much longer, as I eventually became so frustrated with Vampire the Masquerade 20th Anniversary Edition, I effectively rage quit from the system. The players were okay with this, as by the time we started to explore the Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition rules, I had promised that this story would continue after a break in the V5 system. Kolya had exhibited his game-breaking behavior on both sides of the DM screen, but what he did next would put the group on a downward spiral towards finally ejecting him for good. Yeah, no, this guy definitely has quite the god complex. I feel like you're underselling it if anything. Saying you always have a plan isn't really having a plan. It's just being overconfident with nothing to show for it. I actually do get that you weren't super comfortable in the system, and clearly he did know a little bit more about it than you did, but it doesn't really matter because he doesn't know how to play with people at the game table. You can play any version of Vampire the Masquerade perfectly, but if you're insufferable, who really cares, right? One thing I really hate is when a player does something stupid, he's appropriately punished, and then when they re-roll a character, that person kind of leaves off where that other player started. Sometimes they're playing the twin brother looking for vengeance in a story I just covered, for example, but sometimes it makes even less sense, like this guy. He was playing his original character brought back from the dead, but for some reason he wanted to continue the scheme that player 2 was doing, and someone that metagames like this at the game table, if you ever do something to them as a player and for some reason their character dies, they will make sure that every future character they ever play will try to punish you for something they shouldn't even really be aware of. This person doesn't know how to separate out of game and in-game knowledge, which as a player is annoying, but as a dungeon master, it's even more so annoying. Sure, as the dungeon master, you do know everything, but you're supposed to be able to say, you know what, the villain here, he shouldn't really know that, so I shouldn't be able to perfectly punish the players just because they explained it to me in front of me. So let's have the party get their ambush off. It's only fair, right? That's the mentality you should have about metagaming as the DM. But instead, this guy seems to be the kind of guy who laughs to himself saying, haha, this ambush totally isn't going to work because I'm aware of it. For some reason, Freddy will be impressed by this, but the rest of the table really shouldn't be when the ambush goes south. Yeah, the villain was metagaming, he's higher level than us. Of course it doesn't work because you're not going to let it work ever, because that would mean giving us a win. You know, sometimes it's fair to say that maybe someone's a better player than they are DM, but when someone proves to be terrible at both, I think it's time to kick them. Let's see what happens in the final campaign. It's a much shorter one, and it's called Campaign 3, Blue on Blue. Cthulhu. Halfway through my vampire campaign, we admitted a new player to the group, Will. He had gotten off to a rocky start by his own actions derailing a player's plan and upsetting them. But this was his very first time playing a tabletop game, and considering how apologetic he was when he ultimately realized what he had done, and how quickly he learned and moved on, we had accepted him and he had become as good of a friend to us as anyone else in the group. That new player status proved to make Will Kolya's next obsession when it came time for us to play Pathfinder in a pre-baked adventure module DM'd by Sebastian, the player whose character had died in Curse of Strahd due to the never-ending damage-inducing slapstick rolls. Kolya immediately began to harass and prank Will's character, using both Will's inexperience as a player and his character's naivety to bully and torment him in much the same fashion as I described he did to Freddy above. Now, for reasons unrelated to this, Will eventually decided to switch his character out and play something more in keeping with the villainous tone of the party. Sebastian was fine with this, so Will rolled up a lizardfolk barbarian and inserted himself as a bodyguard character to Virginia's witch character, so that he could learn the complicated Pathfinder system and not have to be in the foreground where the decision making was taking place. This apparently did not sit well with Kolya, which honestly most things seemed to piss him off, who had effectively lost his new favorite plaything now that Will was playing a gruff, soft-spoken brute who didn't rise to provocation and generally kept his own counsel. Kolya was instantly aggressive towards Will's new character, openly admitting he was planning on killing him, which he finally did by use of a charm person spell. As an aside, I don't know how in the blue hell Sebastian allowed this to happen, how as a dungeon master he didn't know what the spell didn't check the way the spell worked when all this started, and why, even on the meta level, he didn't simply shut this down when it became clear what was happening. But whatever the case was, as I said, I was not actually present, he didn't intervene when Kolya announced he was casting Charm Person on Will, and without sharing the rules text for the actual spell itself, explained how this allowed Kolya to convince Will's character to off himself, which Will's character then proceeded to do as narrated by Kolya, gruesomely clawing at his own throat until he finally died. Will was so disturbed he didn't know quite how to react. Virginia was furious. The game didn't last beyond that session, and then COVID put the brakes on any plans we had to continue playing thereafter. After this, a few out-of-game flare-ups with Kolya led me to eventually disinviting him from my promised sequel to the vampire campaign, which he took about as well as we would expect. He blocked the bulk of us on social media and removed him from our various group chats thereafter. The rest of us did get to play together again when our country briefly loosened its lockdown restrictions last summer, and without his presence we ended up having an exceptionally fun couple of games. A vampire sequel DM'd by me, a Kingmaker DM'd by Sebastian, where we were able to focus on roleplay and inter-party dynamics, and Freddy found his feet much more comfortably in a post-Kolya group, and became one of the leading lights in my vampire campaign. While there was other issues around Kolya's behavior, like him insisting on hosting D&D games in his hotel room so he could make creepy advances at some of the females in our group, I am aware of how long this post has gone on for, so I thank you for reading this far and won't take up any more of your time. Well, that really came out of left field there at the end there. That honestly could have been a whole RPG horror story on its own. I guess the fact that you don't have any tales about it means that maybe it never got that far, which I'm grateful for. What always fascinates me about these kinds of stories is it's very clear that the rest of the table wanted to roleplay, but you had a person here that as a problem player and a problem dungeon master always wanted to cut through that because they didn't think it was important, but it's something the party overall really loved. So obviously it doesn't really matter how many encounters they run over and over again as a dungeon master if the party just wants to have some dialogue without it being interrupted with onward to the quest giver. You know, it'd be one thing if the guy was a good friend out of game, you love them in all aspects of life besides this, but based on the story it's very clear that you guys kind of hated him out of game too. So if he ruins the fun when you're not playing D&D and he extra ruins the fun when you are playing D&D or Vampire the Masquerade and Story 2, you just gotta cut someone like this loose, because the sooner you do that, the sooner you get to play fun in-person games again. As you guys clearly learned, you could play Pathfinder and have fun, you could play Vampire the Masquerade Masquerade and have fun. It doesn't really seem like it matters what system you guys are playing. Really, the only determining factor if you're going to have fun is if this guy shows up or not. So I really think that's the key takeaway here. No system can fix an annoying player that wants to make everything about them. And in the case of Vampire the Masquerade, if anything, it rewards it just a little bit. So this is a situation where the system will never make it good, but it can make it go from bad to worse. This definitely was a longer one. I'd love to read the comments that you guys have for this story. How much leeway would you have given someone like Kolya before you cut them loose? Honestly, I was pretty done with them like halfway through campaign 1. But hey, maybe Freddy saw something in him that we all didn't, and he just needs like 5 more Freddys at his game table to have the perfect campaign that will totally blow us all away. I really doubt it though. So again, put your comments below. I am really curious what you guys think about this. Make sure to like and hype the video as it really helps the channel grow, and subscribe if you haven't become a member already. I hope to see you in the next video. Farewell for now.